So really excited about the group of people that we have on this panel. Personally, like I said, this just really interests me. This topic does, and you'll get to know about them a little bit more. We'll have them introduce themselves with a little more detail, but briefly, we have Adam Arvidson, we have Katya Gordon, and Dr. Kathryn Haglin, all with great perspectives on this, I think, really important and interesting topic. So a couple reminders for the audience. Please stay muted during the conversation, and if you have additional questions, maybe hold them till the end. And then just a reminder that this conversation will be recorded and posted on the IONI Duluth website for future academic use. Also, before we begin, I would just like to acknowledge that we collectively acknowledge that the University of Minnesota Duluth is located on the traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of Indigenous people. The university resides on land that was cared for and called home by the Ojibwe people before them, the Dakota, and the Northern Cheyenne people, and other Native peoples from time immemorial. Ceded by the Ojibwe in an 1854 treaty, this land holds great historical, spiritual, and personal significance for its original stewards, the Native nations, and peoples of this region. We recognize and continually support and advocate for the sovereignty of the Native nations of this territory and beyond. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm tribal sovereignty and will work to hold the University of Minnesota Duluth accountable to American Indian peoples and nations. At this point, I'd like to kick off the conversation and ask that panelists kind of describe yourself in a little more detail, your background, your current work, what you currently do in regards to communication about sustainability and environmental issues. And I think we will start with Adam, if you don't mind.
Sure, thank you, John. And thanks everyone for being here this evening. I'm thrilled to share the stage with the two other panelists and looking forward to getting to know more about your careers. My current work is that I'm the Director of Strategic Planning for the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board. And in that role, I actually do a lot more policy writing than anything else, including park master plans, sustainability planning for the agency, and a variety of other things. Prior to coming to work at the Park Board in 2014, I had my own consultancy for about 9 years where I did landscape architecture. I'm a registered landscape architect, as well as a lot of freelance writing. So I wrote about design and planning and architecture for national magazines, including Landscape Architecture magazine, for which I was, for a time, the interim editor-in-chief in 2009 and 2010. And continue to write now, though not as much because of the full-time job, which we can get into that if you want to. But perhaps the most recent writing that I've done is about 3 years ago now, I published a book called Wild and Rare, Tracking Endangered Species in the Upper Midwest. And that book is sort of a personal and scientific narrative about Minnesota's federally listed endangered species. And that's me.
Well, thank you so much. I look forward to hearing more. Dr. Haglin, you're next on my screen. Do you want to briefly introduce your work?
I want to mute myself. Yes. So I'm Kathryn Haglin. This is my second year as an assistant professor at UMD. I'm originally from Minnesota. I actually have an undergrad degree from the Twin Cities campus. I went from the Twin Cities campus. I got my PhD in political science at Texas A&M University. From there, I went on to do my postdoc at the University of Pennsylvania, Annenberg Public Policy Center. If you've ever been to factcheck.org, that's where factcheck.org is run out of at APPC. And I was part of their Science of Science Communication group, while I was there. And so I was actually kind of in this like joint thing between Penn and Yale Law School. So I actually lived in New Haven and was like going back and forth between New Haven and Philly. It was kind of crazy and unimaginable in a pandemic how much time I spent on the Amtrak. So yeah, I did that for a year. And then I came to UMD. Now I'm in the political science department here. And super happy to be here because most of my family, my dad's side of the family is from Duluth. So this was a nice getting to come home and be part of the community again. So it's been very exciting. My work is sort of diverse, but I have a solid interest in science communication work, which is what I wrote my dissertation about, and that's what I did my postdoc in. And so a lot of my interests are in about how we can not only better communicate science to the public and combat misinformation in the general public, but also the relationship between scientists and politicians, since as many of us know, scientists often rely on the political process for funding and other types of financial and non-financial support. And I was actually inspired to do this work by meeting a person in physics, which is like a whole long story. So you never know who you're going to meet at a bar when you're struggling to decide what to write your dissertation about. So, and it helps when you date a physicist throughout grad school. So happy to talk about that if anybody's interested. But yeah, so that's a little bit about me.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm really looking forward to your perspective. I kind of the reception of communication. Katya Gordon, same question. You want to tell us a little bit about yourself and your work with sustainability and environmental communication?
Sure. Can you hear me? They're saying okay.
Yep, we can hear you.
I was a little bit unstable before, but I'm hoping I'm stable now. Thank you. All right, so my name's Katya Gordon. I live in Two Harbors, and I really came at this originally in the 90s from a outdoor trip leader, and I used to take youth out in the wilderness, and particularly delinquent kids, and I met my husband that way. And when I first moved to Minnesota, it was in 1991, and I lived up in Ely, and the caretaker at the camp I worked at all winter said at the end of the winter, like, it was just funny how many days of the winter that they had above zero. And he just felt like it was a really warm winter, so many days above zero. And at the time I felt a twinge of anxiety because I knew about climate change at the time, and I felt like I had arrived in paradise, but that I'd gotten there too late. And that sort of started me on the journey of the climate change, and in particular, just being in love with Minnesota winters and wanting to preserve them. And little would I have known that 30 years later, the talk is not about how often it gets above zero in Ely, but how often it gets above freezing in Ely. So that really is one of my central motivations. My husband and I own a charter sailing business. And so we take people sailing on Lake Superior, and we take people to Isle Royale and to Canada. And we particularly love young people and working with kids. And so about 10 years ago, we started something called Sea Change Expeditions, where we take young adults, like university students, as crew, and we sail to different parts of the lake in May and talk about climate change with students and teachers and communities. And this has sort of been our little niche, and it has really helped us to feel like we are sort of on the ground doing something. The first time we presented our climate change on Lake Superior presentation in Houghton, I had made some contacts at Michigan Tech and was a little nervous about all these incredibly high-level scientists coming to our presentation. And after the presentation, one of them stood up. I asked if there were any questions, and he said yes. And I was like, ah! And he raised his hand, and he stood up and he said, "Thank you so much for doing this. We have so much information that we are sitting on somebody needs to be talking to the public about this. So ever since then, I've felt very happy about what the service that we're doing in the community and bringing like Superior communities together. I also write, and so I've been writing a column in our local paper for years and years, and eventually turned it into a book. And the reason I did that was because I was really learning a lot about the way we communicate and of the way we tend to blame people and the way we're divided and all the woes that we talk about today all the time about our society. And I felt like it was really important for the North Shore to just be talking about climate change. So my original goal was just that those words would be more common in everyday language on the North Shore. And it's come a long way from there. Those words are definitely common now. And the book has become this wonderful way to help students write their own climate story and write their own climate column, and to address climate change in a way that's not blaming and that is reachable to your average rural northern Minnesotan. Yeah, so I think that's enough about me for now.
Well, perfect. Thank you so much. Like I said, I'm really excited about the diverse set of experiences that all three of you bring to the table, and yeah, just elated to be having this conversation. The next question, I think we'll go in the same order if you don't mind. And you can approach this from a couple different ways if you like, but the question is, what are the current problems or challenges with current sustainability environmental communication pipelines that you see on either an individual or systematic kind of scale? And if you don't have any challenges, what are some successes, I guess, that you've had or you see? So, Adam?
Sure. This is, I feel like the other panelists are going to have a lot more actual data or human relationships to bring to this conversation, but because I have only written a couple of research journalistic articles that looked at this. I have not studied this in depth. But so maybe what I'll do instead is I'll just tell a little story of what I see and how it kind of caused me to do a bit of a career change from being mostly a freelance writer to actually being a public sector employee. I was really struggling, I think, when talking about any kind of climate change or climate change solutions. And very early on, like back in 2003, 2004, I was writing about green infrastructure in cities across the country for Landscape Architecture magazine when that wasn't even hardly a word. But Landscape Architecture magazine, for instance, with a circulation of at best maybe 12,000, is speaking to a very particular audience. And I think one of the challenges that I always saw is that there are so many different audiences. And when you look at what kind of communication was I going to be doing, my niche, as it were design professionals and planners. And that moves the needle like a little bit, but it doesn't like really move the needle. But meanwhile, you've got writers who are reaching very broad audiences. And I think back even to the mid-century environmental boom, which I studied during my master's degree in writing. Those writers had so many different styles. Some of my favorite writers, my top three: Edward Abbey, Wendell Berry, Rachel Carson. The way that they were speaking to different audiences about roughly the same thing was touching a lot of different people, but they had to do it collectively, right? They couldn't each do it individually. So I got interested in thinking about how do you sort of, and maybe this is a cynical comment, but how do you bypass the people and actually start writing policy around climate change? And so when I went to work for the park board, there was an opportunity. I was initially hired to write the agency's ecological system plan, which is basically a framework to make all park operations more environmentally sound. And there's a lot of writing involved and there's a lot of research. And so those were things that I knew how to do, but it wasn't necessarily about convincing the people of Minneapolis to do that. It was about creating a policy document that was going to guide the operations of an agency that were it a standalone city would be the 4th largest city in Minnesota. The Park Board of Minneapolis is the 4th largest city in Minnesota if it were standalone. So that's a significant impact. And so in that way, I could almost speak to all audiences at once, because because this becomes board supported and it becomes policy of the organization. It touches really all of those audiences, whether you are, a sports field user or a boat buoy renter, or a nature volunteer. It's all going to kind of fit into that. And so to me, I think one of the biggest challenges in my career has been, like, how do you speak to more audiences than those that are right in front of you? And I guess one way that I've kind of moved toward doing that, not that it's, it's everything, but the way I've moved toward doing that is thinking about, writing climate change more into policy language. But you still got to do good communication, because there's community engagement around that, and that's a whole nother story. So I'll just leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Dr. Haglin?
Yeah, so I can really sympathize with this idea about audiences, right? Because as an academic, right, most of the time academics are just writing for like even less than 12,000 people, like very small audiences of specialized people who have found like this one tiny niche in the like world. You write an article and it's like nobody cares. So thinking about how to sort of translate some of the work that I've done with some of my colleagues to a more like broad audience. I know I'll save the talk bit for later, because there's a question I know that the students proposed to me about a particular study that I did. So I'll talk about the study itself when we talk about that. But when we did that study, we purposefully did write up for the monkey cage at the Washington Post, right, to try and make the findings more publicly accessible, to give, and digestible, right? Because, as Alexis probably knows, I make kids read a lot of journal articles, and they're not always the most like user-friendly material that ever happened. So just from like a career standpoint, right, thinking about how to make any research I do about science communication sort of publicly accessible, publicly digestible information, right, and trying to beyond the small academic audience has always been important to me. But just thinking about like other problems, like general problems, and yeah, we have classifications of problems and challenges. These are career problems and challenges, and now here are general problems and challenges. General problems that I see, kind of thinking about how do we communicate about the environment, mostly, have to do with, overcoming politicization and biases that people have when they confront the information in the first place, right? So even if we do write up public scholarship, if there are people are not receptive, even if Adam writes a beautiful article, but people are, not receptive to the information, that's a problem, right? And we have to think about how to deal with that. The other thing that I think a lot about is the extent to which reporting on the studies that we do about science communication and climate communication can be confusing. So, it's kind of a meta problem. There's a problem with studying the problem, in the sense that we often have issues related to measurement, right? How do we measure people's beliefs in climate change? How do we know that those beliefs are sincere? How do we relate them to other things that are going on in the communication environment? And how do you not make too much out of one single study? How do you take kind of all of these sort of disparate findings and try and bring them together into a sort of general understanding of how people receive communications and think about communications about the environment? So yeah, I always think about multiple levels of the problem, like the meta challenge of how do we even understand the nature of the problem, and then how do we overcome the problem itself, and how do we get people to get out of motivated reasoning type processes where people are just trying to find information that confirms what they already think they know. And spoiler alert, like, I don't have a great answer for that because it's really hard and we still don't know how to do it super great. It's definite, but it's a good time to be doing work in the area because, I mean, obviously not just the environment are subject to misinformation and problematic communication these days, as evidenced by everybody feeling bad for me for most of the last 4 years. But you know, it's an interesting time to be doing this type of research. And so I enjoy having this conversation with non-academics, right? People who are out doing different types of writing than I'm doing, because I think that's an equally valuable and important means of communication. And actually, we should probably talk to each other more. A lot of times I think academics spend too much time talking to each other and not enough time talking to actual people who are, like Adam, writing actual policy, you know, that needs to actually be implemented by real people. Yeah, I think what Adam said makes total sense to me.
Great, thanks. Katya, your perspective?
Sure. Well, you asked about challenges and successes, and this is somewhat repeating things, but I do think the echo chamber is one of the hugest challenges, and it's exacerbated by social media. And I think it's truly across the board. I just think we all do it. And one of the first things I have been writing about in my column is get out of your echo chamber. Like, I think our discomfort with discomfort, we just really like to be comfortable, and we like to invite people into our space when what we need to do is go into their space. And figuring out how to do that and how to appreciate the other and really be willing to admit their strengths, and, you know, just sort of all the things that, I mean, I really do see it as a two-way street. But, and I think, you know, my job, I'm going to jumpstart a little bit because the next I know a question coming up is like, was there a single event that got me going? And there was not really a single event, but there was when I first decided to really take a deeper dive into climate change. I didn't really know what to do about it, but we had a event, and it led me to people that were part of the Citizens Climate Lobby. And the Citizens Climate Lobby is the group that really was where I found my home. And climate change became not a sort of a isolating event where you feel like you're insane and everyone else just is acting like everything is normal. But just real arguably this job, which is to build the political will for a livable world. And I love that. Ooh, are you hearing me? I hear my connection is unstable. Give me a thumbs up if you can hear me.
We can hear you a little bit, but maybe if you turn your video off and just, that might help. Just for the remainder, yeah, try that.
Yeah, well, maybe I won't talk too long now in case it's not coming across, but I find there's great success in talking, with children and teachers. I feel like children have never lived in a world without climate change, and it's all pretty standard for them. I feel like talking about Lake Superior is something we all care about, and that's a really good, we've had a lot of success with that. And I think, you know, bringing it down to away from global and into sort of home is a really key thing. Like, you know, I often start a presentation with saying, you know, and this is a discussion of carbon pricing usually. I say, you know, who's to know whether the skier who, who uses more carbon, the skier who flies to Denver and uses their plexiglass or their, you know, poly this skis, or and spends a week on a resort versus the person who snowmobiles out of his home and goes all over the trails around here. Like, there's no telling, there's no blaming here. We solved this problem, and now we created this problem, and now we need to solve it. And so I think like bringing it absolutely down into everyday language is successful. It's hard to do, but it is very successful. And so I'll just stop there. I really don't even know if I'm being heard, so I feel like I better stop.
We heard you loud and clear at the last part, for sure. So
okay, good.
So thank you. Awesome. Well, yeah, thank you. I think at this point I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Beard's class. I know they have some questions, and then afterwards, if there's lingering questions, more than happy to throw those out there.
So Katya, you were the start of this panel, and I think one of the students has a question or two based on the class's reading and discussion of your book. Margot, are you ready to leap forward with something?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was originally going to ask you what your purpose, or I mean, I guess your inspiration was for, choosing to go with climate change on the North Shore, what interested you in that. But in your introduction, you kind of gave the answer. So I spitballed and I came up with a better question, I think. So after reading your book and hearing your input and experiences, what is the most interesting or life-changing thing you've learned about North Shore climate change thus far? And if you can't just think of one, a couple is great too.
I think the thing I've learned, and actually a lot of this I learned from the Large Lakes Observatory, because we do a lot of research to make sure we're giving out good information. The extent to which the has been lost is amazing to me. And it really only happened because we are sort of on the brink of more ice, no ice. There's not that much of a difference between a huge amount of ice and very little ice. And so with the temperature rise that we've seen, our entire ecosystem has changed. And we show these kids, slides of Lake Superior in an ice year and a non-ice year. It's almost like two different worlds. And we talk about how we are humans, we are able to like wear more clothes and turn the heat up or turn the heat down. But if you're a snowshoe hare and you've become white, you can't go back. And if you're a tree and you've lost your leaves, you can't go back. So think of the stress on the ecosystem with just such a dramatic change. And it's year to year, because some years there is ice, some year there's not ice. And then whether or not there's ice has a huge effect on everything else. So I think that's maybe the biggest thing that has impacted me, is learning about that. But the other thing, I'm just going to answer it as a sociologist as well. What have I learned about the people on the North Shore? And I'd say the main thing I learned when I really sort of started to try to have this, to initiate this conversation in every day, is that it's not so much people were not believing climate change. It's just that they were focused elsewhere. And I just think that is one of the keys. And if I read news sources of places where that people who generally don't do much about climate change tend to read those news sources, I don't find a lot of hot denial. I just find interest in other issues and not seeing it as a pressing thing. So to me, that was a much easier barrier to overcome than assuming that everyone is completely stacked against believing that climate change exists or that kind of thing. So kind of a two-pronged answer.
It feels like that rolls straight into Alexis's question, right? Because it's about how do we locate people on the polarizing world of politics and so on and so forth. Alexis, are you ready to leap in?
I sure am. So my question is for Professor Haglin, and I kind of know the answer to my question already because I'm currently taking Professor Haglin's class where she uses this study. But Professor Haglin, your study talks about the acknowledgement of climate change caused by humans or anthropogenic climate change based on the survey responses. Could you explain more about like what impacts these responses, like phrasings of questions, hard and soft, don't knows, stuff like that?
Yeah, so I'll kind of give the quick backstory for those of you who have not been so lucky as to learn about this already, I guess. This is like, this is also like, you wonder how people come up with these harebrained ideas for papers. This is how this harebrained idea came about. We were sitting, I think we were sitting like in a room at the law school at some point while I was doing my postdoc, and one of my colleagues was like, hey, there's this like piece in the New York Times gray matter section today. It's got this like kind of pretentious title. And it was like, oh, what's it called? And it was called Actually, Republicans Do Believe in Climate Change. And we kind of were like, well, that doesn't strike us as super accurate because that's not what most of the studies show. But okay, well, okay, we've got to look at that now, right? So we look at it. And long story short, when we looked at what they had done, it was like, well, that's sure. But it got us thinking a lot about question wording. How do you ask people if they believe in human-caused climate change or not? And does it matter how you ask them the question? Because the authors of that particular study had done some things that were not familiar to us. They had made some different choices. To be fair, there's no one right way to do it. But it got us thinking because they had made a couple choices. It's like, well, we wouldn't have done that. Why did they do that? Does it matter? Let's find out. So we threw together this thing and stuck it on the end of another survey that one of my colleagues was doing. And we tested whether or not different ways of wording the question produced different levels of belief in climate change. So we gave people like statements they could agree on a 1 to 7 scale versus having them pick a statement they agreed with. Does that matter? Can you say don't know? A lot of times people don't let people choose don't know as an answer. They can like skip the question, but people often don't skip the question. It's kind of a passive way to say don't know, but you could have people explicitly be able to pick don't know. Does that matter? Does it matter if you have them read explanatory text about what climate change is before they answer questions about whether they believe in it or not? Does that matter? So we had it was kind of a large experiment. We had like 8 different conditions. It was a monster. But what we found was actually it matters a lot. In our full group of people, we could produce up to a 25% change in belief in climate change just by varying the different types of question wording. And because, of course, we were interested in that sassy headline, we checked just the Republicans as well. And you can get anywhere from 30% belief in climate change to 60% belief in climate change, just depending on how you ask the question. The bummer of the paper is that it doesn't offer some like gold standard of how to do this, because the problem is that you're always measuring something you can never see, right? I can't like drill a hole in Adam's head and see what his real beliefs about climate change are and then figure out how to measure them perfectly, right? That'd be that'd make my job a lot easier, but I can't do that. So it's hard to find like what's the right way to do it. But the point of like the way we talked about the paper was not that we were trying to find the perfect way to do it. What we were focused on was the idea that the communication about the findings and how we relate different findings from different studies together is problematic. Writing something that sort of suggests like, well, this is, the final word on whether Republicans believe in climate change or not is not necessarily accurate. And even for, we even write in the paper, we talk about journalists who are sort of forced to sit there and try and like make sense of these different studies and how they work together, when comparing them isn't always comparing apples and oranges, right? If I run a study with don't know options and Likert scales, and my colleague runs a study with discrete choice questions and no don't knows and explainers, we're probably just going to get different results just because of how we ask the question. And so communication wise, right, we thought a lot about, you know, well, what can we do to just sort of, we wrote the paper to sort of be like a, I don't know if it was a call to action or just a awareness of, you know, hey, how you ask the question matters, and then how you communicate about the studies also matters, right? If you write it up like there's one, you know, this study finds this and that's the end of it, that's not really accurate, you know, and that's not how science works. So yeah, it's a cool paper. I mean, I'm not biased because I helped write it, so I think it's a cool paper. But it was nice because nobody had actually demonstrated the impact of the question wording in an empirical way. I think probably people had known from other things that question wording matters and like whatever, but nobody is like 30% is a big difference. It seems bad that you could be able to double Republican belief in climate change by asking the question differently. That seems suboptimal for science purposes. Maybe someday I'll be talking on one of these panels about how we figured out how to do it, you know, super, super good, but we're not there yet. So like, sorry. Yeah, so I think that's why I think, you know, that thinking about how to communicate about the studies, right? It's another meta problem. The communication about the communication study also needs to be considered as well.
Realize, hey, I need to cue the next student. Sorry about that. And our final student is Zach, and he's got a deep cut for us, I guess is the metaphor, right? When you've got a, yeah, Zach, are you willing to lead us through?
Sure, my question's for Mr. Arvidson. And I realize you mentioned you haven't continued checking out the effectiveness of these simulations where you can sort of simulate someone's home burning down and then get the reaction based on, you know, how it looks to watch your neighborhood burn to cinders. My concern is that this would be akin to watching a film, like a disaster movie, and that it has this sort of volatility in the mind, and that not long after viewing something like this, the effect of making someone think critically about climate change would just diminish. So maybe you can talk about how effective these sorts of simulations are on a longer timeline from when someone views them.
Yeah, I will admit to the group to being really challenged by this question in a good way. I think primarily because I feel like this isn't where my expertise is, hence the reference to deep cut. The article that was specifically referenced, which I wrote about this kind of think tank in Vancouver at the University of British Columbia called the CALP, where they had this visualization room that they could bring communities in and do these full wall simulations of what might happen. They were doing a lot around forest impacts in that case. That was one of the last articles I published before going to work for the Park Board. And so kind of right about at that time was the real kind of pivot point in my career. I will say though, interestingly, hearing about Kathryn's study, like that's exactly the kind of thing I would have totally gone for. Like I used to attend the Council of Educators in Landscape Architecture conference to find obscure academic papers that I could write about in the professional magazine, because even within the landscape architecture profession, we weren't listening to our professors. So anyway, that said, it got me thinking today a lot about simulation. And a couple things kept popping to mind. So I'll just throw these out here, and whether this is a worthwhile answer or not, you all can decide later. But one thing that I worry about with simulation, and this maybe comes from like watching too much science fiction, But I feel like anytime you simulate sea level rise in particular, and there are award-winning projects by students and professionals in landscape architecture and planning every year that show new ways to simulate sea level rise. Immediately what you hear people say is, well, we better build those walls then. Like the response is not, my home is at risk and we need to think about a new way to live. It's, let's protect these homes. I mean, when, here, I'm gonna name drop Penn for you, Kathryn. When Ian McHarg was doing studies and envisioning the New Jersey shore and Staten Island and impacts to quote unquote climate change in the mid 1960s, as he was essentially developing what became the foundation for geographic information systems at Penn, the response from people was, well, we need to then nourish these dunes and protect the seashore so that they don't erode. When his intent was to get them to move, right? His intent was to say these are low suitability landscapes for human development and you should move. And that is not what happened. So that's one thing that I don't know much about empirically, but I'm curious about whether that's really effective in kind of unintended, the intended result. I wrote an article one time about Grand Forks, Minnesota, which was devastated by flooding and then a fire during the flood. Many of you may remember this if you were around at that time. On the heels of that, which was an actual disaster, they did clear out 2,500 acres of homes and create a greenway there. And yet, just upriver in Fargo, instead of buying out homes and instead of people moving, they're building a huge diversion around that city, which has been controversial for decades. They're not even listening to folks just downstream of them and how they, quote, solved the problem, because Grand Forks hasn't had another flood that has impacted the city since they made that greenway. So they have a simulation in their backyard that they can go visit, and it's not moving the needle in Fargo. That said, I got a project that we just completed at the park board, and this didn't occur to me that it was a simulation until this question came up. So I thank you for the question. We just finished a master plan for Minnehaha Creek in Minneapolis, which is a creek that runs through South Minneapolis. It's about 5.5 miles of creek length. And when we started on the project, there were a lot of concerns about increased precipitation. You know, we're seeing a lot more precipitation coming as rain than snow. You all probably know the statistics, 7 years of rain in 6 years. We've had major floods in the creek. So instead of at a starting point for a project, which typically would be that we would outline the FEMA floodplain and then build our project around that, we instead modeled the future FEMA floodplain. So we, with our environmental consultant, we were actually able to create a new model based on the precipitation we're receiving now, and we drew a new flood line. FEMA's in the process of updating their flood lines, but what we're using is not their official line. We're using what we think the line's probably going to be. And so we drew that line on every map that we presented to the community. It was there in every community conversation, and we designed our infrastructure around that line. So we tried to keep trails high up out of there. We tried to make sure our infrastructure was back from that line. And that line became very real over the course of 2 years of the project. And you actually had people discussing it during community meetings when there were some times when people thought, like, you're moving this kind of too close to my home. And then other folks would say, yeah, but it's got to be out of the yellow line because the yellow line is our future flood. And so in that case, and again, I'll go back to that plan was adopted and is our policy guide for all the capital investments that will happen in Minnehaha Creek. So that simulation, as it were, if we could call it that, that simulation was embedded into a planning document and got adopted as policy. So at the end of the day, it actually doesn't matter if people believe that simulation or not. We're still going to design around it, whether a few folks kind of like it or not. And that didn't actually occur to me until today. We had been sort of using it as a matter of course, and I never would have characterized it as a simulation until I was asked this question.
Thank you.
I'm so happy you asked this question because I'm literally writing down an idea that I now have for a study. And I would be happy, Adam, if the Minneapolis Parks Board ever wants to figure out if you can show people simulated materials and see the longevity of whether or not it makes people more likely to be worried about climate change, we should talk about that.
Sounds good.
Because that sounds like an interesting research question.
Yeah.
I'm super grateful to the 3 students who prepared the questions and asked them. Super grateful to you guys for talking about not just being writers, but the importance of writing and the ways that you're doing the work that you're doing. And now I can toss it back to John, who has the clearinghouse question, right? The question that sends us all home.
Yes, the classic end note. Yeah, well, before I ask it, I just want to again thank you. The perspectives here today are just fantastic, and yeah, I just thank you for being here tonight. The question that I want to ask is, what inspires you about the work you do? Why do you do it? And yeah, what drives you? So I don't mind who starts if somebody wants to jump in.
I'm unmuted. I realize so I can go. Whoops. That's a tough one. I think it honestly takes me back to the bar story about how I got interested in this at all. Because so my partner is a physicist and we were at a happy hour and the physics department head at Texas A&M showed up and he's a forgetful guy. He thought I was in the physics department. And I'm like, no. And so we got to talking and he talked about, I told him what I did and he started going on this long story about how this huge project that they were going to build a particle accelerator in Texas and how this whole thing was going to happen, but it all fell apart because of politics. So basically, if you know anything about particle physics, it's the collider over in France, the Large Hadron Collider. We could have built that in Texas if we had, gone ahead with this project, but politics got in the way for a variety of reasons. And sort of what I thought was great about that story was that there was so many different actors involved, right? And public opinion, I was already interested in political behavior and I'm always going to be interested in political behavior. But how we could improve relationships between scientists and politicians and the public, right? And I think the pandemic has definitely shown us the importance of science and all of the really great things science can do if we give scientists the resources and the ability and the confidence that they need, to have public trust and do good work, which is not to say that science is perfect by any means. But I think that's always what kind of keeps me excited about it. The diversity of things I can work on, and the number of people that can be impacted by positive change in science communication and writing about science and creating good public scholarship that people actually read and can actually care about, which is why books like Katya's are so important, right? We need people to be utilizing their personal experience and marrying that with the science and having people work together more. And so I always say, that's why I always joke that I wrote a dissertation that a physicist was interested in. But I think that's what keeps me excited about it, at the end of even years later after the dissertation was over.
Yeah, I'll maybe jump in and give Katya the last word. But I'm really, for me, I've always envisioned my career as being one that closes the rift between humans and their environment. And I've tried to do that in a few different ways. It's given me a fairly unconventional landscape architecture career, in quotes. You know, and a big part of that is translation. It's translating ideas. You know, I mentioned earlier how I actually used to read these academic papers and try to open that up to folks that would not visit those sites. You know, and interestingly, in the context of that, because there was the reference to this article that I wrote about visualization. That was one of the last articles I wrote for Landscape Architecture magazine. Ironically, this month, Landscape Architecture magazine issue has an article of mine, you know, 9 years after I last wrote for them. And it is about translation, quite literally. It is about the Great Lakes Ojibwe tribes, a coalition of 11 tribes who have written a climate adaptation plan that departs from Western science methodology and actually creates new Ojibwe language to refer to some of the things that were needing to be modeled in the plan. Most notably, invasive species, which the Ojibwe felt was inappropriately negative against those species, to call them invasive species. So there's a new Ojibwe word, which translates as non-local beings, which is now enshrined in policy, tribal policy. And so I got the opportunity to sort of doubly translate by bringing that work in both languages to a design audience. And at the park board, not a lot of people want to get involved in policy, right? And so, you know, folks have ideas, and the fun part of my job is kind of trying to figure out how does that become like actual policy and change on the ground. I have to sort of untangle the bureaucratic mess and try to translate that back to actual movement on the ground. And I really like that about working in the public sector. Not everybody does, believe me. But I sort of like the bureaucracy of it, as long as that can be translated. And as long as I can have a hand, I like to have a hand in trying to make that legible to people. So I'll end there. So you can take it home, Katya, right?
Sure. I think what really just drives me is the whole idea that we all heard you can't solve a problem at the same level that it was created, and just seeing how incredibly true that is with this, and seeing how we're really being pushed to rise into becoming better people. And while, you know, all the problems seem to be converging, the solutions are converging as well. And like, that's just an amazing thing happening. And just, I don't know, I feel like the community is what drives me. I could never do this alone. And just really fun to hear other people doing it. You know, sometimes I feel like the whole world is like one human. You know, you got your heart, your lungs, maybe you're the immune system, Adam, and you know, it's like all just, it's just amazing what's happening. So just being a part of a much bigger thing, and it's uncomfortable, but it's also wonderful. And I have one more thing. When I first joined CCL, you know, politically is arguably the hardest area to work, because it's the farthest behind. And when I first heard this idea that Congress actually does not create political will, Congress responds to political will, it was such a huge light bulb in my head. It was like this firing off that just exploded in my brain. And I was like, oh, so it's really our job to create the political will. And it always has been. That's always been how it works. And as a historian by school, by my, you know, education, that kind of thing is fascinating to me. So that drives me also.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Beard, for hosting us, and thank you to our three panelists. I really, really appreciate your perspectives, and yeah, I just can't say thank you enough. Yeah, have a great night.
Thanks for
Thank
having
you,
me.
everybody.
Thanks for being here, students.
Thank you. Students in the class, hang around. Guest speakers, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Beard. I really appreciate it. Hopefully that was a worthwhile conversation. I found great.
Yeah, it's wonderful, and the fact that it will live on the internet afterwards is doubly awesome.
Yeah. Thank you.
Take care. All right, so now there's a mechanism by which, there we go. No. Show non-video participants. There everybody is. Thanks, everybody. Anybody got any thoughts about that one? Oh, I should be turning off the recording.